In this lesson, we'll explore the process of utilizing the wrireToDepthBuffer. So this is an output node that can be used as a way of outputting your own custom depth information for your objects. So let's take a look at how we can actually set this up. What we first need to do is take a look inside of the render settings, and if you're using Maya 2009 or higher, you should have access to the new pass rendering system, and that's what we'll utilize to create this particular buffer. So in our case, what we first need to do is create one custom depth buffer, at least one, and we can actually write the data that we want into this. So we'll create and close, and then we'll just leave this as it is and assign it to the current pass, so that way this will actually be rendered out. Now, one thing that is important to take into account is that this particular buffer is not necessarily accurate as far as writing out real accurate depth information. Really, it just allows us to overwrite the depth information with something of our own choosing. So try to keep this in mind as we start to work with this particular node. So let's start with this depth buffer. And the first thing we need to do is choose which pass this is actually going to write its data out into. So in our case, we can write this out to the custom depth pass that we just created a moment ago. And now we need to actually plug in some kind of an evaluation trigger. So in our case, this can be triggered usually by a material. So in our case, all we would have to do is take one of our materials, middle click, drop it into the evaluation pass-through. And now, any object that is using this particular material can have a new custom depth that we define. So in our case, we can set the depth to something like 10 or any arbitrary value. And let's go ahead and make this a little bit more apparent by adding in another depth pass or another depth buffer. We can actually have this second node write its depth information into the same custom depth pass. So we can actually have multiple buffers that write their information and combine them into this one output that's going to be rendered. So for this trigger, let's take another one of our materials, drop this into the pass-through. So now any material or any object that's using this red material can have a depth of, let's say, 20. And we can do this as many times as we want for as many objects as we want. So here's our third one. Again, it will write its depth information into this same depth pass. Take our orange material, drop that into the trigger, and this can have a depth of, let's say, 30. Again, this can be any arbitrary value that we want. So once we have a few of these set up, let's go into our render settings, and let's make sure that we set some kind of an output format. And we'll render this out so we can take a look at what we have. So let's give this a name, something like custom depth. And then we can do a pass name that gets added onto the end of this. There we go. So now we'll have a file that gets written out called custom depth, and then whatever the name of our pass was. In our case, the underscore, or the last portion of that, will be custom depth also. So let's take a look at what we have. Let's go to render and batch render this out. So once this has been rendered, we can now take a look inside the images directory that we have set this to actually be output to. And you can see that we have our custom depth pass that has now been written out. Now again, as I mentioned, we do have the ability now to control this, and you can see that all of the buffers have written their individual depth informations into this one single image. The problem, though, is that this is not accurate, because you can see that based on the shading that the objects that typically are supposed to be closest to the camera will be the brightest objects. And you can see that that is not the case, because this material we assign to have a depth of 10, this material we assign to have a depth of 30, this material has a depth of 20. So you can see that, again, by having this level of control, we sacrifice accuracy. And we can wind up sacrificing the actual usability of this. So one of the things that we can do, or another thing that we can do to even push this a little bit further, is that if you have multiple objects that are sharing the same material, it will go ahead and write any material information into the trigger. So let's really kind of see what this means. Let's take the blend material, and let's go ahead and drop this onto something like the background. There we go. So again, as I mentioned, every material that is assigned to a particular object will write its information out. Okay, so whichever one of these is actually holding the red blend as its trigger will now be able to write data from this new object into that same buffer because, again, it's using this material. So let's check out the difference for this. Let's go again to Render, Batch Render. And now if we go back and take a look at the new version of this custom depth that's been output, you can see that now the information or the depth for this background has been written out as well. But again, this really illustrates the problem that we can run into whenever using this custom depth pass. And that is the fact that the dice that we have right here and the background were both using the same material. And again, if you recall from the custom buffer, that we had this set up to where any object that used this material would be written to the frame buffer as having a depth of 10. So again, this is not an accurate depth result that we get back. So for most situations, I would recommend sticking with the typical diffuse, or rather the normal depth pass that we have the ability to output. But if you do, for whatever reason, need to actually write out your own custom depth information, we do have that ability available to us. So that's a look at how we can utilize this wrireToDepthBuffer as a way of writing out our own custom depth information.